Tonight we drift to Bistrița in the Carpathians, circa 1890, where an English traveller pauses at a modest inn, oil lamps and printed menus beside wood smoke and horse bells, an easy place to rest before the road climbs toward the Borgo Pass. If you enjoy these gentle journeys, feel free to like and subscribe. Evening settled over the old market town as the traveller's carriage rolled in at a careful pace, and the first lamps began to gather their soft halos against the blue-grey of the sky. The settlement sat in the Austro-Hungarian realm, layered with names that told its history. Bistrița in Romanian, Bistritz in German, and Bistrița in Hungarian, each name loyal to its own tongue, yet pointing to the same streets. Maps from different desks would have written those letters differently, but the cross-hatched lanes and slanted roofs remained the same beneath them. Timbered shop fronts offered their wares behind wavering panes, and the cobbles kept the memories of years of hooves, iron tires, and winter salt. The traveller, an Englishman bound for the mountains, watched the last colour thin from the day, and noted how the town held itself with both gravity and hospitality. Nothing hurried, not even the smoke rising from the chimneys, which found its way upward as steadily as the hour. Street by street, the little square received night as a host receives expected company, making space without fuss. Shop windows posted neat printed notices, some set in German Fraktur, some in a Latin hand, and others with Romanian diacritics catching the light. Dates of market days stood beside prices for kerosene and ribbon. A smith's hammer, quiet at last, had left a lingering fragrance of iron and coal that braided with the humbler sweetness of bread coolin' in paned bakery doors, while tiled stoves within homes exhaled the seasoned scent of softwood. Horses clip-clopped over the stones, their bells a gentle punctuation to the low murmur of traders checking the last tallies. From the parish tower, a clock marked the hour with a restrained toll that rolled lightly down the rooftops, as if mindful of shutters and sleepers. Overhead, slim wires strung along poles hinted at messages far away, but in the lanes the talk remained close and local, the kind that moves by nod and hand, not by code. The traveller watched without comment, taking stock of direction and road, aware that the route he sought angled eastward and up, away from the glow and into darker contours. At the edge where the streets leaned toward the foothills, a modest inn kept its door unlatched and its signboard legible to the region's 3 tongues. Its painted plank read Bistrița Han in Romanian, Gasthaus Bistritz in German, and Bistrița Fogado in Hungarian, the words stacked with courteous equality, a promise of soup and a bed no matter which vowels a guest carried in his mouth. Sparks threaded from the chimney into the faience blue dusk and faded before they met the first true dark. Inside, the house wore its half-modern comforts honestly. Oil lamps with glass chimneys sat in polished brackets, and the day's menu had been printed neatly, a small convenience from the press that smelled faintly of ink and starch. The floor, smoothed by years of boots, held the warm creak of wood, while the benches and tables kept burnished edges, scarred lightly from knives but scrubbed with salt and care. Above the pegs along the wall, a narrow shelf bore wax stubs for when the oil ran low, a quiet concession to older habits. From the stable lane came the agreeable chime of harness bells, a sound that neither pushed nor called, only reminded those indoors of horses steaming gently under the roof next door. The traveller stepped across the threshold and found a corner where the lamplight pooled without glare, allowing the eyes to settle easily after the long, dimming road. The printed menu, propped between salt and a small vase of last-seasoned dill, offered familiar Austro-Hungarian fare rendered in local translation: a hearty broth, cabbage stewed to silk, a dish of potatoes edged with paprika, sour cream shared among them, and a plate of white cheese from a farm along the river. He chose with a nod and let the room's even rhythms do their work. A serving boy moved like a cat along the tables, placing plates, collecting coins, and whisking away crumbs with a folded cloth. When the soup arrived, it warmed the hands before it warmed the chest, and its steam carried both garden and pasture, a mildness that suited an evening of arrival. A heel of bread crackled softly under the knife, its crust cured by a careful oven, its heart still moist. Now and then the door drew a little draught that teased the lamplight and checked the flames, but the shadows only breathed and settled, finding their niches along the wainscot. Behind the counter, the innkeeper kept a quiet eye on the sky beyond the panes, glancing from the red edge cloud to the ledger where rooms were penciled in. He spoke without mention of urgency, remarking that the road upward, which travelers called the Borgo Pass, was known among locals as Tihuta, and that the weather there kept its own counsel even when the town felt calm. Snow came early some years and late in others, he said, but wind was faithful to the height, and the turns could hold frost where no frost lay in the square. He noted that wagoners preferred to begin before dawn, when the ruts were firm and the teams took the grade without sweat, and he observed that a pale moon tonight would lighten the shoulders of the hills. His tone held no warning, only the practical care of a host who had seen many carts start and return, and who knew that certain days leaned one way and certain days another. In the pauses between his easy sentences, the wolves in the distance sent up a sound that travelled like thread through cloth, not close, not coaxing fear, merely telling the hills that night had taken its place. The traveller listened as one might listen to rain on a roof one does not own, conscious of shelter, aware of the larger weather turning slowly beyond it. In the common room, object met object in a pleasing quiet. A brass coat hook held a felt hat whose brim had seen mountain drizzle. A bench with a smooth dip remembered the weight of teamsters. A stoneware jug left a circle of moisture on the table as it cooled. A printed timetable for the post carriage was tacked beside a naive map of the high country, its rivers inked in a thread of blue, and the ridge lines shaded by a careful hand. The oil lamps, with their modern convenience, still cast the kind of light one imagines in older stories, generous in the center and gentle at the edge, encouraging voices to fall and thoughts to lengthen. From the doorway to the yard, the scent of horse and hay arrived in intervals, mingled with a suggestion of resin from split spruce stacked under a lean-to. The traveller set his pocket watch next to the jug and let its steady tick mark time in companionship with the crackle from the stove's grate, an agreement between metal and ember. The night drew on as a craftsman draws a line without haste, and the establishment settled to that depth of stillness in which both the old and the new find a natural truce. Beyond the panes, the town thinned quickly, giving way to fields and then wooded slopes that rose in patient stages toward the spine of the range. The road that would lead to Tihuta began almost shyly out of the last houses, as though it meant to be a lane forever, then gathered certainty as it traced the contours of the foothills and lifted into open air. Stars pricked their small, reliable holes in the fabric of the sky, and the dark shape of the mountains, neither hostile nor inviting, stood like a set of folded wings waiting to open. Wagon ruts hardened in the cooling weather, catching sheen where frost began to lay its invisible grain, and a trickle of water in the ditch found a thin skin of ice, more audible than visible. Somewhere a dog answered the far call of the wolves with a single conversational bark, an acknowledgment across distance that did not stir any guest from their place. The traveler looked once toward the northeast, and then toward the soup and bread before him, choosing to inhabit the small square of warmth for a while longer, knowing that the larger map would still be there in the morning. Along the walls, old stories hung in small signs and carvings, not in words, but in the patina of wood and the polish of handles, each touch built from routines repeated until they became customs. A pair of antlers above the doorway bore the dust of several winters, their points softened by air and time, while the ceramic stove, tiled in green, kept its heat like a pond keeps light. A child, the innkeepers perhaps, counted coins in a saucer at a far table, pursing lips in concentration, and then arranging them by size as if building a small city. The mother moved past, her apron faintly flower-streaked, and rested a hand on the child's shoulder. Light from a lamp pooled on the counter where a newspaper lay folded, its masthead printed in Hungarian, but its advertisements a tidy mix of tongues, announcing a traveling haberdasher and a shipment of salt. The traveler allowed his attention to blur slightly, so that the different alphabets seemed less like boundaries and more like variations on a theme, each playing a part in the evening's gentle chord. Every sound found its distance, a spoon against a bowl, a footfall across the threshold, the soft, occasional click of the signboard outside as it adjusted to a change in the breeze. Somewhere between the first lamplight and the moment when the stove sighed and settled, the town and the high country reached a kind understanding, and the inn kept that agreement at its doorway. The threshold marked more than weather. It suggested the scale would shift beyond the last fence, and that what had been measured in streets and doors would be measured in ridgelines and ravines. The traveler, neither in haste nor in delay, let the sense of transition find its level, as steady as water in a bowl, and felt the evening do what evenings do in places where routes cross. He had come far enough to recognize that names carry their own climates. Bistrița with its Romanian lilt, Bistritz with its German crispness, Bistrița with its Hungarian cadence, and that all of them pointed in concert toward the same notch in the mountains. The pass would be called the Borgo, in the mouths of those who used guidebooks and timetables, and Tihuta by those who had family in the valleys and cattle on the summer meadows, and each name would help the road hold its meaning. For now, the inn lent its modest, even light to the edges of weariness, and the town gave the traveler a night's pause before he stepped toward the higher silence waiting just beyond the last lamp. The public room revealed its mixed age in the way light and paperwork shared the same table. Kerosene lamps, each with a bright glass chimney faintly smudged by careful wiping, spread a steady bloom that reached the corners without glare. The smell of the fuel was clean and almost sweet, threaded with smoke from the kitchen and the resin note of fresh-cut kindling. A printed menu lay on a slate board, its crisp edges and tidy serif lines announcing a local press with pride in its ink and spacing, the type just uneven enough to show the touch of hands. Near it, A narrow counter held an open ledger where accounts were marked in florins and kreuzer. The columns ruled by a steady pencil and darkened here and there by a blot where the steel nib had hesitated. The traveller stood a moment to look, noticing the way old numerals and new schedules brushed against each other like neighbours on a narrow street, each giving way without making a fuss. Worn beams crossed the ceiling, their grain polished by years of heat rising to meet them and settling back in winter nights. Between them, the ceiling plaster bore faint hairline cracks and the colour of cream, lending a homely quiet to the upper air. The ceramic stove anchored the room in a square of gentle radiance, its glazed tiles painted with small pastoral scenes and borders of vine leaves that caught and returned the lamp glow with a soft sheen. From the iron door came a slow breathing of heat, and when someone fed it a pine stick, the flame shifted with a muffled sigh, and the tiles remembered warmth for a long time. A bench ran along one side, curved to the stove's corner, and a thin wool blanket lay folded there for guests whose coats had not quite kept out the evening. Floorboards, smoothed by soles and swept with real care, creaked only when the heavy pot moved from hook to table, and then fell back into the hush that collects in places used at a patient pace. The traveller took a place at a small table where the lamp's circle made a tranquil island, and the menu offered simple dishes with the confidence of things done often and well. Cabbage soup with dill and a curl of cream, fried river trout dressed with parsley and lemon, mamaliga steamed to a pale gold, slices of smoked pork that asked for brown bread and pickled cucumbers. These were set out in neat lines with prices that fit the columns in the ledger. He chose the soup and trout, adding a cup of strong tea, and the innkeeper nodded with an understanding that came of long practice, not ceremony. While he waited, the traveller loosened his gloves and let the heat of the stove reach his knuckles, listening to the measured tap of a ladle and the soft scrape of a wooden spoon at the pot's rim. On a peg near the door hung a folded railway timetable printed on stiff paper. He could make out station names that stepped into the foothills and then farther, towns which, to his eye, looked like rows of consonants punctuated by rivers. The idea of arriving by iron road and leaving by horse seemed to meet in that single folded chart, as if it were a handkerchief in which the modern world had neatly tucked a pocket of older habits. Voices drifted with the comfort of people who did not need to be loud to be heard. A phrase in Romanian smoothed into a greeting in German, and then picked up a Hungarian word that fit the point at hand better than either, as if the talk itself were a braided rope laid on the table between friends. An elderly man with a beard the colour of linen spoke with a careful, rounded accent learned in schoolrooms, while a younger driver, still creaking from the cold, answered in the brisk, clipped syllables of the road. The innkeeper moved among them and let each language land just where it liked, replying to questions about the morning's frost in whichever tongue reached her first. A notice tacked near the mantel announced the telegraph office hours in tidy block letters, and below it a pencil line extended the Sunday opening by some minutes, perhaps after a petition or a hard winter's need. The traveller watched the way eyes paused on such signs, a glance that belonged to a century that trusted paper and stamps as much as word of mouth, while still relying on the latter to explain the former. Supper arrived with no fanfare and every care. The soup carried the fresh scent of dill and a sour edge beloved in the region, a taste softened by cream and rounded by a slow simmer. Trout, pan-fried to a crisp skin and pearly within, rested alongside wedges of lemon, their brightness lifted by a sprinkle of salt that had travelled farther than any item on the plate. Bread came in a folded cloth, warm as a pocket, and the butter was worked by hand into a pat with the faint pattern of a wooden paddle. The traveller ate steadily, with the unhurried hunger of someone who had measured the day by wheels and hill shadows, and took pleasure in sipping tea that had steeped just beyond bitterness. Between mouthfuls, he noted the slender fork with a slightly mismatched handle, and the way the plate's edge showed a hairline chip filled with light, marks that suggested a life well used rather than reduced. Coins murmured against the wood as a pair of carriers settled for their meal and a bed. The silver caught the lamp in a restrained glint, each piece bearing the familiar profile that had looked out from pockets for decades and would, in a little while, be replaced by newer faces and figures. The innkeeper's finger traced down the ledger to find their names, written once in spring and again when the hay was cut, and she added tonight's line with the same neat slope. A violet stamp, made with the kind of ink that modern chemists had coaxed from coal tar, marked the date, its color a small urban luxury beside the rough wool sleeves and steam from the soup. The traveller watched the quiet ceremony, the grace of units and fractions, florins and kreuzer, grouped and carried, until the page had the logic of a tidy field. He liked the way that arithmetic drew a net that did not bind, only supported, holding together suppers, shelter, and the cost of lamp oil, without troubling the conversation. A gust shouldered the door and then stepped back, bringing in the faint sparkle of cold air that always seemed to carry distance with it. Harness bells answered this opening with a brief corrugation of sound, not sharp, but lively, and then went still as a boy led a chestnut mare toward the stable yard. The innkeeper glanced at the traveller's coat, and then at the window where the glass wore a thin bloom of breath at the bottom pane, and she mentioned the ridge beyond the next village in a tone that was both matter-of-fact and kind. Snow had clung in the shaded gullies that afternoon, she said, and the wind up there tended to gather itself after midnight, best to start without hurry and to carry one more layer than seemed necessary at the hearth. He thanked her and made a note on his folded leaf of paper, the pencil giving back a small squeak as it met the grain, and he pictured the road as a ribbon with quiet fur along the edges. The stove popped, and the conversation hummed on, as if the room understood the mountain's habits and offered the ordinary protections it could. Warmth, a cup refilled, a woolen scarf laid ready near the peg. Signs of the wider world kept themselves modest, as though they had asked permission of the beams. A cast-iron clock with Roman numerals ticked with a sound a little less organic than the click of cooling tiles, and yet not out of place, each minute marked with the measured certainty that trains relied upon. A small card announced a production in a provincial theatre 2 towns away, the date framed by a decorative border printed in a black that had started to soften at the corners. A box of safety matches with a brand name and a picture of a lighthouse sat beside the tea tins, red-tipped sticks in a world that had only recently learned to handle phosphorus without risk. An enamel sign for petroleum hung near the doorway to the yard, its colors still bright, promising a clean flame and glass chimneys that would not cloud. On the shelf above the counter, a stack of envelopes tied with cotton twine waited for the morning post, their edges neatly aligned, as if they themselves enjoyed being addressed and dispatched. The traveller, with his teacup warming his hands, sensed that each of these small inventions had filed discreetly into the room without jostling the older things. They'd taken their places as one might take a seat at supper and pass the bread before speaking. The night deepened gently, taking on the weight of snow beyond the town and the resin of heated wood within. From the hills, the far-off voices of wolves drifted in the way surf might, rising and falling without urgency, a part of the landscape's conversation rather than an alarm. A framed icon watched over a corner table with a gold ground that shone softly in lamplight, and a sprig of dried herbs hung above a doorway for fragrance, its leaves long ago given up to the room's air. The traveller finished his meal and let the tea cool on the saucer, feeling the ease in his shoulders that came when the day had been carried as far as it would go. At another table, a young man traced the stations on the folded railway timetable with his finger, while an older cousin pointed out a better connection, and their voices braided again as timetables always suggested choices. It seemed to him, in that lamplight, that the inn held on to both ends of a rope, one tied to roads and bells and the stubborn comfort of tiles, and another looped through paper, stamps, and a clock's unblinking face, and there was no quarrel between them at all, only a steady working together that made a winter evening human and kind. Supper began as a gentle arrangement of small comforts set upon a scrubbed table that carried the faint sheen of long use. The English visitor took a chair by a window whose panes reflected the warm halos of oil lamps, while the town's lights dwindled in the glass like embers cooling in a grate. A printed bill of fare, crisp and slightly browned at the corner, lay beside the plate, its type neat and modern against the age-softened wood. From the stove in the corner came a steady, agreeable tick, the metal settling into its temper as the coal bed caught, and the smell of resinous pine drifted with it. Utensils chimed now and then, not with chatter but with the muted rhythm of people taking their supper, a private percussion that steadied the room. Somewhere beyond the door where the yard opened to the street, bells on a harness sounded in a slow hush, their tone briefly silver and then gone again into the evening. Wood smoke kept company with the light, and together they made the simple room feel like a safe pocket in the long valley night. A small bowl arrived first, carried by a young server with sleeves neatly rolled, and the clear broth within shone almost golden beneath the rim of lamplight. It held a few ribbons of carrot and a handful of chopped parsley, the surface trembling when the spoon touched it, releasing the clean, calm fragrance of bone and herb. The first sip refreshed more than it filled. Warmth moved through the traveller's chest with the evenness of breath after a long day's road. A basket of bread followed, its cloth still warm from the oven, with a heel crusted to the right degree, and a middle so tender it yielded with a faint sigh of steam. Alongside lay a round of soft cheese, barely salted and dew-fresh, with a thin skin that had the sheen of cream and the mild scent of fields just grazed. The guest broke off a careful piece and let the edge of the cheese soften across it, listening to paper turn at a distant table where a ledger or newspaper was being consulted. The printed menu, held now and then for curiosity, carried words in 2 tongues and a sprinkled handful of accents, a quiet reminder that many roads met here before the track climbed to lonelier country. Next came a plate that made room for regions and seasons to sit together without fuss, a square of polenta cut from a fresh pot, its surface smooth as a sunlit field, and tender cabbage simmered with a breath of caraway. The polenta gave way softly under the fork, golden and faintly sweet, as if corn itself had stored summertime and was releasing it spoon by spoon. The cabbage had a savory depth, the leaves translucent and mild, like a patient conversation stretched over an afternoon. A ladle of juices pooled clear and comforting at the edge of the plate. A spoon of stew added color, paprika bright as a small flame yet preserved in gentleness, more warmth than heat. It perfumed the air with pepper and sweet onion, the sauce clinging to the spoon with a shine that promised steadiness rather than surprise. From the kitchen came the quiet rise and fall of pans moving onto heat and away again, a lullaby of work measured by habit and care. When the server returned to ask if anything else was needed, her question was soft and practical, carried on the faint scent of flour and stove wood. A second course was offered in a calm voice, fish taken from the cold streams that ran down out of the Mountains, or mushrooms gathered from the autumn damp of nearby forests. The traveler asked for the river trout, more as a nod to the road ahead than a hunger for another plate, and soon a small specimen arrived with skin crisped to a bronze shimmer. A curl of butter melted across the flesh, drawing a gentle line of brightness that lifted the clean scent of the fish, and a scatter of parsley gave it a green punctuation. The first bite carried the chill of water translated into nourishment, the firmness of the flakes balanced by the butter's quiet richness, and the hint of wood smoke that lived in every corner of the room. Someone in a heavy coat came in out of the yard and shook the wet from his hat with care. The door closed without a bang, and the lamp glow gathered itself again. Outside, a cart passed with so slow a pace that the iron tire on its wheel could be heard moving over a stone and then finding earth again, a patient measure of distance in the night. The stove ticked another note, and the air settled into the kind of hush that comes when supper is half done and all the hurry has already gone. Concern about the weather found its way to the table without the shape of worry, carried by the innkeeper when he came to ask after the meal. He spoke of wind at the higher turns and the way snow sometimes grabbed at the pass after an otherwise reasonable day, his words more like a map drawn in the air than a warning. There was talk of a coachman who preferred to start after sunbreak in such conditions, for while the road held firm enough, the early hours could surprise a wheel at the stream crossings. The guest nodded and asked after the distance, and the reply made room for the realities of mountain travel. A matter of hours by pace and daylight, a matter of patience by season and chance. A pause opened, and far off in the low hills a chorus rose and fell, long and silver over the rooftops, not sharp enough to catch at the heart, only old enough to belong entirely to the land. One of the locals glanced up, then smiled into his mug, as if a familiar page had been turned in a very old book. The innkeeper, with the same gentleness as before, suggested a second log for the stove in the guest's room, and promised a waking knock at a reasonable hour. A small glass of plum brandy was set down with a respectful clink, the spirit clear as rainwater, yet holding the memory of orchards and late sun. The first sip warmed the tongue and then the throat, and by the time it had lowered itself to the stomach, a lazy bloom of heat spread outward under the waistcoat and into the hands. It was not the kind of drink that asked for conversation. It did its work politely, without demanding attention, steadying thoughts that had strayed to switchbacks and pine shadows. On another table, a pair of travelers shared a modest beer from a nearby brewery. the foam leaving delicate lace on their glasses as they exchanged notes about the road to the east. Above them, lamp chimneys kept their little galaxies of soot, and now and then a wick was trimmed, and the light improved by such small, practiced care. The Englishman broke the last of the bread and wrapped what remained in a square of clean paper offered by the kitchen, a simple insurance against the hunger that can emerge in a high valley. The sound of pages turning returned again as someone consulted a route list, rustling as softly as moth wings. And then came quiet, the kind that asks nothing of a person but the courtesy of being present. The end of the meal passed in a rhythm of finishing touches, each small gesture as reassuring as the last. The spoon turned in the empty bowl, the knife laid parallel to the fork, the glass lifted to catch the final light. The server collected plates in a slow fan from table to table, keeping the balance easily as if her hands knew the weight by heart. A few mushrooms in cream were offered as a final taste, earthy, tender, and content to be simple, and the traveler accepted a spoonful, pleased by their soft bite and the way sour cream rounded them. On the wall, an old framed map of the district kept its sagging paper under glass, streams marked in fine ink, the mountain shading delicate and patient, as if the peaks were content to wait. Somewhere in the kitchen, a kettle sighed, and the innkeeper called for linden blossoms, making a tisane customary to the house for those bound uphill at dawn. When the cup arrived, steam rose with a honeyed scent, floral and pale. It rested in the hand like a small, reliable lamp. Outside, the wind shifted, and the bells on a distant harness answered again, less like a summons than like a reminder that roads continue, whether taken now or in the morning. By the time the cheese rind and crumb had been swept and the plates returned to their shelf, the room carried the softness of a story drawing toward its middle chapters. A couple at a corner table finished a quiet exchange in German, their voices fading as they leaned back, content to share silence. The English guest signed a slip for the meal with a steel nib that whispered along the paper, the script small and neat, like a note left in the margin of a guidebook. Fresh logs were carried through on a shoulder, shedding a gentle dusting of bark, and the stove thanked them with a deeper glow. Through the window, the lane looked purplish with evening, the bakery's awning across the way already folded for the night, while the smell of yeast hung in the air as a relic of labor. Fine snow teased the lamp halos in the yard for a moment, then gave up and slipped back into the higher clouds. Supper had steadied the body, and the body answered with unhurried breath, as if the valley itself had ladled out the warmth and asked only that it be carried well into the mountains when morning came. The evening's talk turned gently to weather and distance when the innkeeper brought out a creased map and spread it on the polished counter. A fingertip, browned by years of tending fires and tack, traced the road from the market square up through meadows and into the darker lines of the hills, pausing where the pass tightened between ridges. He spoke of winds that came down from the higher country with a slow persistence, not cruel, but insistent, and of the way cloud could sink without warning and sit lightly on the trees until lantern light seemed to find its own breath around it. Names of small places, scarcely more than bridges and wayside crosses, marked the way with a cadence that felt older than the paper that carried them. He described a timber gate that sometimes stood open, sometimes latched, depending on the herds moving to late pasture, and he marked a creek where water ran quick even in cold months. The traveller listened, warming hand and sleeve at the drift of heat that came from a nearby stove, and noted how calmly the distances were given, always by hours rather than by miles. Preparation, the innkeeper said, was less about grand equipment and more about modest readiness repeated without fail. Fresh oil in the lamps promised a steadier flame when the road narrowed. An extra rug across the knees kept a body at ease until the carriage rose above the last fields, and a string of bells on the harness signaled presence when fog softened edges and bowed the firs. He said bells were a polite language on mountain roads, a kind of soft announcement around bends where sound carried first and sight followed a moment later. Snow was not expected this week, he added, but the high valleys hoarded the cold, and a traveller kept warmer for having expected it than for being surprised by it. Hooves on frost-hardened ground gave off a quiet, agreeable note, he remarked, and iron shoes bit well, so long as a driver chose the crown of the road and stayed away from the smooth sheen near the drainage ditches. The conversation moved through these details the way steam leaves a kettle, steady and simple, and each item made the passage ahead feel less like chance and more like a careful routine. Schedules had their own music here, he continued, and the postal coaches proved it. The official coach would pass on its appointed hour, punctual as ever, he said, and it would climb with the practiced patience of drivers who had learned to read the angle of the light on snowbanks and the hollows where ice lasted. Private teams, by custom and comfort, set out at first light to catch the best of the road while it was firm, and the air had that clear, dry bite that seemed to keep horses content. The inn kept a list of men who knew the bends by heart, men who had names that floated through the district like the old tunes, and whose reins had shaped to their hands from seasons of climbing and descending. A driver could be called for morning, the innkeeper assured, and the traveller would find a carriage waiting with lamps trimmed and a hamper set beneath the seat. There was no haste in his voice, only the solid ease of someone who had arranged the same thing on many nights at this time of year. Local knowledge, the innkeeper said, travelled as surely as any letter, carried from one season to the next in small remarks and remembered signs. A coppice of birch just below the crest told where the wind had turned. A wooden cross by a fallen boulder marked a spot where, in spring, water could undercut the outer edge, and a pale boundary stone, half mossed, stood as a subtle warning that the next curve swung wider than it first appeared. He told of a wayside bench near a shepherd's hut where drivers liked to rest their teams for 5 minutes, listening to the steady breathing and checking buckles before the long ascent resumed. In summer, bees visited the thistles there, he said, but in this season only the thin smell of resin and distant wood smoke carried, and sound took on a clarity one could almost taste. A pair of crows sometimes sat on the post above the bridge, and the superstition that once hung about them had thinned into a simple habit of nodding to birds that kept company with the road. The details were given without drama, like the way someone might recite a family recipe, and they accumulated into a map the printed one could not fully hold. He spoke, too, of the way drivers kept their teams in comfort when the gradient steepened. Breathing mattered, so they paused between stretches, rubbing along the shoulder with a quick, practiced hand and checking the lay of the collar so that leather did not pinch. Hoofpick sat in an easy place in the toolbox, along with a lantern wrapped in cloth and a coil of chain that was needed perhaps once a winter, but never left behind. In fog, he said, a driver listened more than he looked, for the fall of hooves and the hush of the trees told the shape of the road better than the eye could, and the bells spoke to any cart unseen ahead. On clear nights, the ridges sometimes showed a faint band of light where frost held to the grass, and moonshine made the roadside stones gleam just enough to sketch their line. Somewhere up in the folds of the hills, wolves might carry their long voices, more a thread of sound than a cry, and the teams flicked an ear and settled, taking the note as part of the land's old choir. The room around them quietly supported the conversation, with modern conveniences sitting companionably beside older tools. A printed timetable for the postal route hung near a wooden peg where cloaks had been placed, its corners curling and edges annotated in pencil by years of practical correction. An abacus rested beside a stack of receipts, and a brass key fob lay where it had been set after the last guest had found his door. The jars behind the counter shone with oil's faint amber, and the polished glass of a lamp reflected the faint gleam of lettering on a bottle of ink. Near the stove, a child's wooden sled stood propped as if it had been repaired and then forgotten, a reminder that this was a room where many kinds of preparations met and waited their turn. The traveller, seated and attentive, accepted a small refill of warm wine and took in the soft cadence of their exchange as if the words themselves were part of supper. Arrangements settled with a clarity that felt like good housekeeping, and the innkeeper began to name particulars as one would when packing a trunk. The driver would be called to arrive before dawn. The team would be a steady pair, dark-coated and even-tempered, known for their sure pace on the long pitches, and the carriage would carry 2 lanterns forward, one on each side, with wicks trimmed fresh. A woolen rug, woven in sober blocks of color, would be folded over the seat, and an extra was promised for across the knees should the air bite more sharply than expected. A small hamper would be set under the footboard with bread, cheese, and an apple or two, and a clean bottle would hold boiled water that had cooled to a comforting warmth. The bells, he said, had been polished by an apprentice that afternoon, and they would ring with that small, agreeable chime that spoke of courtesy more than caution. If the sky held clear, they would be on the ridge when the sun's first light found the high grass. If cloud sat low, they would feel the world condense into close, companionable distances where the road and the trees and the harness all seemed to lean in and confer. There was talk of payment, simple and fair, and of where the driver liked to stop for a brief rest once the worst of the ascent was done. He recommended a place where a spring came straight from the hillside into a wooden trough, cold and steady in all months, and said the water there seemed to wake tired eyes and gladden horses. He mentioned a boundary marker carved with initials, the work of a mason whose children still lived in town, and said that every driver nodded to it as to an old neighbor. In winter, when snow lay deep, sleigh runners took the place of wheels on the high sections, but the road just now wanted iron and patience, and these it would receive. The innkeeper's father had taught the signs to him, he admitted with a small smile, and he had passed them along to his own son. One day the boy would sit where he sat and speak the same names in the same order. The traveler felt the pattern of generations in those modest lists, a reassuring sense that the hills, whatever else they held, respected a steady hand and a prepared traveler. Outside, hooves rang now and then on the stones of the square, and the sound drifted in through the slight crack of the door as another guest came and went. A cart rolled past with a deliberate rhythm, a man's voice murmuring to his team under his breath, and then silence closed again like felt. The lamp on the counter needed the slightest turn of its wick, which the innkeeper performed with that particular attention the new fuels demanded. It gave back a clean glow without smoking the glass. Far off, somewhere to east or north, the long thread of a wolf's voice lifted into the air and went unseen between roofs and trees, and no one in the room seemed troubled by it. The traveller took another bite of bread and looked down at the map one last time, tracing in mind the bends and bridges and pauses that now felt friendly, as if the road itself had introduced its features by name. When the map was folded and the inked lines went away, the sense of their shape remained, steady as the warmth that radiated from the iron belly of the stove. When the bolts were slid home and the shutters leaned into their frames, a softer order took hold of the house. Voices settled into whispers, and then into the calm of floorboards cooling under the day's last footfalls. From the yard came the lingering smells of damp straw and harness leather, mingling with the faint sweetness of apples stored somewhere below the stairs. An oil lamp hung at the passage gave a small, even breath, its glass warming to a honey glow that left corners in a comfortable half-shade. In the public room, someone placed a metal cap over a kettle and nudged the embers with an iron, not to stir them so much as to lay them to rest. In that hush, the walls kept what they knew, the rhythm of travellers arriving and departing, the cadence of the town's market day, and the long patience of roofs in mountain weather. In his upstairs room, the English guest let his hearing do the work of a window. The bedding held the faint spice of sun-dried linen, and the mattress carried the soft give of wool, familiar to anyone accustomed to old inns and their economy of comfort. On the washstand, a ceramic basin caught a little ring of lamplight, and a bar of hard soap looked like a pale stone pulled from a stream. A travel guide with dog-eared pages lay beside his gloves, and his coat, brushed but rain-spotted at the hem, hung from a peg that had been worn to satin smoothness by years of use. The lamp's mantle whispered, a quiet that felt almost like a living presence, steady as a sleeping animal. Through all of it he placed the next day's road in his mind, not with urgency, but with the practical inventory of hills, miles, and the time light requires to climb them. From the street, one last cart went by, as if reluctant to concede the hour. Iron rims told a measured line along the stones, and the driver spoke to his horse with the kind of voice that expects to be obeyed without offense. A trace of rye flour drifted on a draught, no more than a suggestion from a baker's doorway where the flue still drew warm. A latch clicked somewhere, and then another, calm ripples of ordinary caution moving through the neighboring houses. The church clock lifted its note once and then waited, unhurried, not so much marking time as nodding to it. After that, the town's exterior quiet became a companion, not a void, with small occupancies the ear could follow like the lightest of threads. Far higher than the town's chimneys, voices answered one another along the dark ridges. They came over the hills in long phrases, too old to be owned by any single century, and spaced far enough apart to let the listener breathe between them. The sound had no edge to it, only a breadth, as if the slopes themselves shaped and returned it with a kind of courtesy. He recognized it without experience, the way one knows the sea before one has crossed it, because stories, maps, and older travelers had already drawn the idea. In the houses below, no windows burst open, no alarm took hold. People who live with forests treat such calls as part of the season's inventory, as wind and hoarfrost are. For the guest on the bed, the distant chorus folded into the night as weather folds into itself, and the lamp drew him back to smaller domestic matters. The cut of his boots, the neat repair at his cuff, the address in an unfamiliar hand tucked into his inside pocket. More than once that evening, the innkeeper had touched the map and spoken of frost on the high road, tracing with his thumb the bends where shadows stay longest. He had not discouraged travel so much as supplied it with the kind of care born of steady winters, pointing out a refuge of spruce where the wind cooled at midday, and a spring that ran clear even under a skin of ice. He promised to have the small carriage made ready before first light, the driver sound in his judgment and fond of the mountain horses, which were thick-necked and sensible. A room by the stable would be stirred early, he had said, with a lamp and tea, the same lamp and tea of a town that knows departures and wishes them well. With that calm provision, the guest felt his journey held in competent hands, not ushered forward, only gently arranged. Out beyond the rooftops the pass waited, not with a banner but with the practical truth of earth lifted into long green backs that would, by day, be grey with stone and, by evening, blue with distance. What made the house restful was the concord of centuries under one roof. On the mantel in the public room stood a blue-glazed stove tile painted with a vine in a style older than anyone present, and beside it a rack of well-thumbed journals with notices of new rail connections and exhibitions in distant capitals. The ledger on the counter had a printed heading, and a steel nib pen laid ready. Yet the wooden counter itself bore knife marks from a time when bread and cheese had been portioned there. A bell for summoning help sat within reach, though most of the time a call by name did the work, and someone would step from the kitchen with hands warmed by steam rising from a pot. In the yard, a pump creaked carefully as the night worker drew water for the horses, and the bucket left a dark ring on the stone, a circle that would lighten as the cold pulled it away. All of these belonged together without quarrel, the present and the older present, and the traveller, turning over on the bed to ease a shoulder, felt himself placed inside that agreement. The wolves called again, and the answer came from further east, thinner, as though distance had stretched the voices into silver wire. Their measure changed the scale of the night and made the town seem a little smaller, not diminished, only gathered under its roofs the way a cloak gathers around shoulders. In the stable a horse shifted, and a harness strap clicked gently like a key turned half a notch. The smell of ash cooled to something faintly mineral, and the last little pops from the hearth counted out their final statements before they belonged to memory. Somewhere a child stirred and then slept, and the soft padding of a parent's feet made a quiet loop through the room and back again. There was a sense of listening that the whole building shared, as if beams and shelves and the iron of the stove took a breath and held it, not tensely, merely attentive to the mountain's unhurried speech. Plans for the morning presented themselves without urgency, each detail finding its place as naturally as a spoon on a saucer. He would take coffee that reminded him where he was by the way sugar dissolved slowly in it, then bread that had been baked against brick and carried a crust with a whisper of smoke. The driver would lead out a horse with winter hair still thick at the knees, and the yard door would open on a lane pale with daybreak frost. There would be the small business of farewells, the nod that passes between host and guest and needs no elaborate language, followed by the simple weight of a coat buttoned to the throat. Later the town would be behind him, and the high road would set its terms with shadow, wind, and an occasional spill of light where a hillside faces full south. For now the bedstead was firm, the coverlet a friendly weight, and the thought of that first mile seemed already tucked into his pocket, like a coin meant for a toll he would willingly pay. Before dawn, that concord thinned to a faint hum. Glow from a banked stove slipped under the door and made a blade of brightness on the floorboards, and the lamp's flame turned very low, steadied with the kind of discipline that comes from proper trimming. Silence in the corridor became the preface to footfalls that had not yet begun. And in the town a baker folded the day into being with a wooden peel and the learned push of his shoulder. A cock answered without insistence, and from the far ridges nothing came down except the certainty of cold air travelling under the stars. He drifted between sleep and waking, not quite taking the morning in hand, but letting it arrive with the same dignity as the night had withdrawn. On the edge of the old world and the newer one, in a house that kept both, he held to the knowledge that this would be the last warm pocket before the road rose, the final harbour before mountains spoke in their bright, exact daylight, and the closing entry in a quiet ledger of inns whose pages smelled of wood smoke and ink. The oil in the lamp settles to a softer glow, and the room takes on the patient hush of wood at rest. He sits with his hands around the cooling cup, feeling the small warmth move through his fingers the way a brook moves under ice, steady, hidden, and kind. Outside, the slope of the town leans toward the dark, shutter by shutter, while the hills beyond breathe like sleeping beasts, untroubled and enormous. Somewhere up there the wolves thread their way along a ridge, their voices now only a suggestion, like ink thinned with water. This is the hour when the world loosens its laces. Brass fittings dim to a matte gold. The printed menu curls a little at the edge. A drift of wood smoke hangs in the rafters, carrying the faint sweetness of resin and last autumn's wind. He watches the rise and fall of the wick's flame and recognizes in it a small promise that a light need not be loud to keep company with the dark. The innkeeper's final glance was gentle as a folded shawl, nothing said, yet something understood about weather and roads and the way mountains ask for quiet. There is feeling, not quite thought and not quite dream, that this place stands on a seam. The floorboards remember the press of hooves and the beat of faster days. The door remembers hands that spoke in other languages. The bell above it answers to calendars old and new. Here, inked timetables share a table with star lore. Here, an envelope sealed in tidy crimson wax can rest beside a sprig of juniper, and neither seems out of place. He is not choosing between eras so much as stepping through a veil so thin it makes no sound. It is easy to imagine just beyond the low eaves, a road gathering itself into the pass, pale with frost and threaded by the line of the ditch. Wheels will find it at dawn, as wheels do, and hooves will spark softly on stones, and the day will reveal the ribs of the land with a courteous, wintry clarity. There is nothing impatient in this knowledge. The mountains are unhurried, and the town is in no haste to be anything but itself. The traveller yields to that pace without effort. Breath slows, shoulders drop. A map folded and slipped into a pocket feels suddenly light. He draws the curtain halfway and leaves the rest to the night. In the yard a horse shifts, tack whispering against wood. Somewhere a latch settles. The snow, if it comes, will arrive on feet as light as moths. He lies down to the mild creak of linen, to the praise of silence that good walls give. Beyond the window, the Carpathians keep their long ancient watch, their dark furs lifted like candles that do not burn. Closer in, the lamp lowers its flame and becomes a small, steadfast star. Between one breath and the next, the inn holds him. The road waits kindly. Morning will find him resting in the soft cup of this threshold, where old and new shake hands without a sound. And when the first pale ribbon of day unties the hills, it will do so gently, and he will rise gently, and the world will go on being wide and patient and very quiet.